The first thing Sable Drummond did when she walked into that boardroom was set down her mop bucket. Not because she'd forgotten she was carrying it, she hadn't. She set it down slowly, deliberately, the way a person sets something down when they want the sound of it to land in a room. The metal handle rang against the tile floor and the echo moved through the silence, like a stone dropped into still water. 7 people in expensive chairs looked up from their phones and their folders and their cold coffees. None of them recognized her. That was the point. She had been cleaning the offices of Harwick Capital for 11 years. She had scrubbed the glass walls of that exact boardroom every Thursday morning since the building opened. She had emptied the wastebaskets, mopped around the chairs while the senior partners worked late, replaced the paper in the printer on the 42nd floor, more times than anyone had ever thought to count. She knew which executives took their coffee black and left the cups on the windowsill. She knew which ones crumpled their rejection letters and buried them at the bottom of the bin. She knew which ones cried in the stairwell on bad days because the stairwell was part of her route and people stopped seeing her a long time ago. And then one morning in February, they fired her. Not personally. That would have required someone to look at her. The letter arrived in her locker, printed on Harwick Capital letterhead, signed by someone in human resources named Colton Briggs, whose name she had never once heard spoken aloud in 11 years. The letter cited a restructuring initiative, a transition to contracted cleaning services. Effective immediately, she was thanked for her contributions. The word contributions was in quotation marks, though she suspected that was an accident. Sable read the letter standing in front of her locker in her uniform with her cart still half loaded behind her. She folded it once, slid it into her coat pocket, and finished her shift anyway because she hadn't been told not to. And because the bathrooms on 40 were still dirty, and that still bothered her regardless of what any letter said. The man responsible for all of it, including the letter, was Harwick Capital's new chief executive officer, a 41-year-old named Conrad Harwick III. He had taken over from his father 18 months earlier, with a mandate he described in every interview as modernization. He spoke often about efficiency. He used the word streamline so frequently that it had become something of a joke among the junior analysts, though never within earshot of him. Conrad did not take jokes about himself lightly. He was not strictly speaking a cruel man. He was a man who had grown up inside wealth, with enough insulation between himself and the world, that he'd never developed the habit of looking closely at it. He walked through offices without making eye contact the way people walk through airports. Everything around him was infrastructure. It existed so that he could move through it. He didn't think about the infrastructure. The cleaning staff transition had been his assistant's recommendation. The assistant, a brisk young woman named Piper, had presented a cost-benefit analysis showing projected savings over a 5-year period, and Conrad had approved it in under 3 minutes. He had never known any of the cleaners' names. He had certainly never known Sable's. What he did know, though only in the vaguest terms, was that his mother was alive. Rosalind Harwick was 68 years old and had been his most loyal supporter and his most honest critic in equal measure for as long as he could remember. She had been the one to call him out after his first bad quarterly report. She had been the one who told him when he'd been rude to a colleague at a company dinner. She was small and sharp-witted and had spent 40 years making sure the Harwick name stood for something she could be proud of. And Conrad had inherited exactly enough of that quality to be genuinely bothered when he fell short of it, which was more often than he admitted. She had been sick for 14 months. The diagnosis was specific and serious enough that the first 2 specialists they consulted independently told them the same thing. Without a particular kind of intervention, a stem cell donation from a biologically compatible donor, Rosalind would not recover. The compatibility requirements were narrow to the point of being unlikely. They had tested family members. They had engaged private medical networks across the country. They had quietly reached out through hospital volunteer programs in Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal. For 6 weeks, nothing. And then a match was found. The donor had come forward through a community health screening at a clinic on Danforth Avenue in East Toronto. She had seen a notice posted on the clinic bulletin board, one of dozens that had been circulated to community spaces across the city, in the hope that someone, somewhere might see it and qualify. The odds of a match were small enough that the hospital coordinator had almost not included the East End clinics in the outreach. She was glad afterward that she had. The donor agreed immediately. She completed the process without complaint, missed 4 days of work, declined compensation, and asked only one thing. She did not want to be identified to the family. She did not want to be contacted. She did not, under any circumstances, want to be thanked. Rosalind recovered steadily over the following months. Conrad visited her 3 times a week at Sunnybrook, and watched the color slowly come back into her face, and allowed himself only when no one was watching, to feel the full weight of how close it had been. She talked about the donor sometimes in the particular way people talk about miracles. Not with sentimentality. With a kind of quiet reverence. Somebody chose to give part of themselves to a stranger, she said once. They didn't know me, they just decided I was worth saving. That's not nothing, Conrad, that's everything. He had tried to find out who it was. He had asked the hospital administrator. He had had his lawyers make inquiries. He had been told, with varying degrees of firmness, that the donor's identity was protected and would remain so. He had eventually stopped asking, though he never quite stopped wondering. The cleaning staff letter went out in the third week of March. Sable Drummond received hers on a Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon she was gone. Conrad didn't notice, there was nothing to notice. The offices were still clean on Friday morning. The contracted service had begun immediately. The transition was seamless in every way that the word seamless is used by people who only count the things that are easy to count. It was Piper who first mentioned something was off, and even then she only mentioned it obliquely. She said the ficus on the 42nd floor looked like it needed water. She said the supply closet on 38 had been reorganized in a way she didn't understand. She said the small things that keep a building running the way Sable Drummond had kept them running without anyone realizing she was the reason they ran. Conrad wasn't listening. He was in his office on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after the terminations, when his phone rang with the hospital's number. It was Rosalind's care coordinator. His mother had had a complication. It wasn't life-threatening, but she needed him to come. He was at Sunnybrook in 20 minutes. His mother was awake and more annoyed about the interruption to her afternoon than she was frightened by the medical situation, which Conrad found both reassuring and completely characteristic. He sat beside her bed in the vinyl chair and they talked for a while about nothing consequential. The Blue Jays, the novel she was reading, his cousin's new house in Kelowna that everyone agreed was too large. After an hour her care coordinator came in to update her chart. She was a soft-spoken woman in her 50s named Dr. Anand who had been with Rosalind's case since the beginning and who had the specific quality of making everyone in any room feel like they were being taken care of. She set a folder on the bedside table and excused herself to check on another patient and said she'd be back in 10 minutes. Conrad didn't mean to look. He had no interest in medical files. But the folder had slid open when it landed, and a corner of a document was visible, and on the document was a photograph that had been attached for what the header described as post-donation identity verification. He recognized her face immediately. It took him a moment to place where from. Then it came to him all at once, the way things come back when you've suppressed them without meaning to. The uniform. The cart. The woman who had cleaned the boards in the room where they held the quarterly reviews. The woman who had mopped around his feet at least twice that he could actually recall, though he had looked away both times because looking felt unnecessary. Sable Drummond. Her name wasn't on the document, but her face was unmistakable. Conrad sat back in the chair and for a moment did not fully process what he was looking at. Then he did. He thought about the 6 weeks of searching. He thought about the lawyers and the administrators and the private networks, and the quiet, coordinated effort to find one person in the entire country who could save his mother's life. He thought about the community bulletin board on Danforth Avenue and the odds the coordinator had described as nearly prohibitive. He thought about someone seeing a notice pinned to a corkboard next to advertisements for guitar lessons and lost cats and deciding, without hesitation, to walk in and ask if they could help. He thought about the letter in the locker, the word contributions in its accidental quotation marks. He sat in that hospital room for a long time after Dr. Anand came back and finished the chart update and told him his mother could go home by the weekend. He sat there while Rosalind fell asleep, her breathing steady, her color better than it had been in over a year. He sat there until the hallway quieted, and the dinner carts stopped rolling past the door. He was not accustomed to feeling things he couldn't immediately do something about. His whole professional life had been organized around the principle that every problem had a lever, and if you found the right lever and applied the right pressure, the problem resolved. He was good at finding levers. He was less good at sitting with the problems that didn't have them. This was one of those problems. He went to his office the next morning before anyone else arrived. He pulled the employment records. It took him longer than it should have, because he'd never had cause to look at the cleaning staff files, and they were organized by a contractor name he didn't immediately recognize. He found her file. He found her last known address. He read her 11-year employment history, the performance notes, the attendance record, which was nearly perfect. He found the record of a commendation she'd received 8 years ago from a building manager named Terrence, who had since retired, noting that she had stayed 4 hours past her shift during a water main break to make sure the damage on 36 was contained before it reached the server room. The commendation was a single paragraph and had been filed with no follow-up action. Conrad read it twice, then he drove east. Sable Drummond lived in a narrow semi-detached house in Leslieville, with a small front garden that was doing its best despite the remnants of a hard winter. There were snowdrops coming up along the front path. There was a boot scraper by the door shaped like a hedgehog that was either charming or deeply practical. He couldn't decide which. He sat in his car for several minutes. He had prepared something on the drive over. A clear, structured explanation of what he had seen, followed by an acknowledgement of what he had done, followed by a concrete proposal for how to address both. He was good at structured conversations. He had built his career on them. He knocked anyway. She opened the door in a cardigan and reading glasses and looked at him with an expression that was not surprise. It was closer to the look of someone who has been waiting for something to arrive and is mildly interested to see what form it took. "Conrad," she said. Not a greeting, more like an identification. He hadn't told her his first name was Conrad rather than his title. She'd known it for 11 years from the directory board in the lobby. He said, "I need to talk to you." Then he said, "I'd like to, if that's all right." She considered this for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. The inside of her house was the kind of organized that takes years to arrive at. Not Spartan. Full of objects that had clearly earned their place. Photographs on a narrow shelf in the hallway, plants on the windowsill, a stack of library books on the kitchen table with a notepad next to them where she'd been writing something down. It smelled like tea, and something baked that morning. She didn't offer him tea. She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down and looked at him steadily, and he understood that if he had something to say, he should say it. He said, "I was at Sunnybrook yesterday, visiting my mother." He stopped, started again. There was a file on her bedside table. A post-donation document. "I saw your photograph." Sable looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked back at him. "I wasn't supposed to see it," he said. "I want you to know that. But I did, and I have to." He stopped again, because the structured conversation he'd prepared had dissolved somewhere between the car and her front door, and what he was left with was the actual thing, which was harder to organize. "I've spent 14 months trying to find out who saved my mother's life. And the whole time you were cleaning my office." Sable folded her hands on the table. She didn't say anything. "And then 3 weeks ago," he said. She nodded. "Once. He told her he wanted to reinstate her position. He told her the contracted service would be terminated, and that he intended to bring the building's maintenance staff back in-house. That this had been his error and he took responsibility for it and he would make it right, not only for her but for the others who had been let go. He told her he would cover the lost wages for every week since the terminations. He told her, with some difficulty, because it was not a word he used often in the context of his own behavior, that he was sorry. Sable listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and outside a streetcar went past, and the windows trembled slightly. Then she said, "I didn't do what I did for your mother so that you'd owe me something." He said, "I know. I did it because the notice said someone needed a particular kind of help, and I happened to be the kind of person who could give it." She paused. "That's it. That's the whole reason," he said. "I understand." She looked at him for a moment with the same expression she'd had at the door, calibrating something. "What you did with the letter," she said. "That was wrong. But you didn't know." She said it matter-of-factly, not as absolution, just as a statement of what was true. "It doesn't change the fact of what happened. But it's part of the picture," he said. "I'd like the chance to change what I can." The reinstatement happened within the week. Conrad's legal team moved quickly and the contracted service was given the required notice. A memo went to the affected staff. Sable's name was not mentioned in it because she had asked him not to mention it, and he had agreed without argument. What he did do, and this is the part that his board found genuinely difficult to process at the quarterly meeting, was establish a formal employee recognition program at Harwick Capital, the first one the company had ever had. It was simple. Each quarter, any employee at any level could be nominated by a colleague, a client, or a manager for what the internal documents called the Drummond Commendation. The name was not explained in the documentation. It was not explained in the presentation. When one of the directors asked where the name came from, Conrad said he'd explain it later and then moved on to the next agenda item, which was about the building's sustainability audit, and no one followed up. Sable came back to work on a Tuesday. Nobody made a fuss of it, which was how she had asked for it and how it happened. The supply closet on 38 was back in order by Wednesday morning. The ficus recovered. Several months later, on a morning in late October when the light was coming through the office windows, at the particular gold angle it only manages in Canadian autumn, Rosalind Harwick arrived at the 42nd floor for the first time. She had recovered fully. She walked without a cane now and her doctor had cleared her for travel, and she had insisted on visiting the offices, which she had not done since before she fell ill. Conrad walked with her through the floor. She stopped at windows. She asked good questions about things on people's desks. She shook hands with people and looked at them directly when she did it, which he had watched her do his entire life, and had never quite been able to replicate with the same ease. He had told her some of what had happened. Not all of it. Enough that when they reached the service corridor near the supply closet on 38, and Sable came around the corner with her cart, Rosalind knew who she was before Conrad had a chance to say a word. Rosalind stopped, Sable stopped. There was a moment that Conrad would think about for a long time afterward. The two women looking at each other in the middle of a hallway that smelled like floor polish and recycled air and the faint ghost of somebody's lunch. He had expected his mother to say something gracious. She was good at that. But Rosalind didn't say anything right away. She stood there, and something moved across her face that was quieter than gratitude and older than relief. The expression of a person who has been handed their life back and is now standing in front of the person who handed it. Then she said, simply, "I know what you gave me. And I know you didn't want anything for it." Sable said, "No, I didn't." Rosalind nodded. "I spent 30 years running a fundraising board for sick kids," she said. "Do you know how often we put out calls for donors and got nothing?" She paused. "You walked in off the street." Sable said, "I saw the notice at the clinic." Rosalind said, "A lot of people see notices." There was a beat of quiet. Then Sable said something that Conrad was not expecting. She said, "I almost didn't." She said it simply, not as a confession, just as something true. "I'd had a long week, I was tired, I almost walked past it." She looked at the cart beside her, something to do with her hands. "Then I thought about my mother. What she would have done." Rosalind said, "What would she have done?" Sable said she would have walked in. Later, after Rosalind had finished her visit and Conrad was walking her back to the elevator, she put her hand briefly on his arm. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You should fix the recognition program." She said, "Make it mean something. Not just a name on a list." He said, "It does mean something." He told her about the name. Rosalind looked at him. Then she said, "Does she know it's named after her?" He was quiet for a moment. "She should know," Rosalind said. "Not as a grand gesture. Just because she should know." She looked at him in the way she had been looking at him since he was a small boy, making choices that were easier than the right ones. People who do good things quietly deserve to know they were seen. He went back to the supply corridor on 38 that afternoon. Sable was restocking the shelf. He stood in the doorway and told her about the program. He told her it was named after her and why. He told her it had been put in place because of what she'd given his mother, and also because of what she'd given back to him, which was harder to name precisely, but had to do with the understanding that you can walk through the same building as someone for 11 years and never actually see them, and that this is its own kind of failure. Sable listened. She straightened a stack of paper towels on the shelf. She didn't look at him while he talked. When he finished, she said, "You could have just fired the contractor and left it at that." He said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly, the way she seemed to require. Then he said, "Because the contractor wasn't the problem." She looked at him then. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth, exactly, more like the careful withdrawal of a reserved judgment. The particular expression of someone who has decided to leave a door open that they were not obligated to leave open. She said, "All right." He said, "All right." He went back to his office. She went back to the shelf. Some weeks after that, one of the junior analysts on the 39th floor submitted the first official Drummond commendation. It was for a woman in the mailroom named Bia, who had spent 3 evenings after her shift helping a colleague prepare for a citizenship test, asking for nothing, telling no one. The award was a handwritten certificate and a small financial recognition, and a mention in the company newsletter that Bia had not been told about in advance, and which made her cry in the break room in a way that she seemed embarrassed about and that her colleagues were glad to have witnessed. Conrad heard about it secondhand, as he heard about most things that happened in the building he ran. He was in his office, going through the quarterly numbers, and Piper knocked and told him about it in the clipped, efficient way she delivered all information. And then she said she didn't know anyone had noticed. Conrad looked out the window for a moment at the fall skyline, at the lake going gray and silver in the late afternoon light, at the city doing what cities do, which is hold the lives of people you'll never fully know. He said, "Most people don't know anyone's noticed. That's why you have to tell them." Then he went back to the numbers, and upstairs on 38, Sable Drummond finished her route the way she always had, carefully, without rushing, leaving each room a little better than she'd found it. The way her mother had taught her, the way she'd always believed it should be done.